Hey guys, for today's video, what I thought I would talk about is overseas Filipino workers, more commonly referred to as OFWs. And one of the situations or the dilemmas for those living in the Philippines is that there are more, how can I say this? Basically, there are more people than there are good jobs. Or another way to put this would be there are more people than the current economy can support. And one of the solutions that many Filipinos look to for this is they're able to get contracts, and they're able to get basically contracts and temporary visas and that kind of thing to work in another country, and then they will send some or most of that money back to their families in the Philippines. So again, those people are called OFWs, and in fact, if you go to the airport when you're coming to visit the Philippines, you'll see an OFW lane specifically for those contract workers. So that's the term OFW, and to give you an idea of how big of a deal this is, I looked this up on Wikipedia last night just out of curiosity. And according to Wikipedia, there are about 10% of the population of the Philippines works overseas. About 10% of the population, about 9 or 10 million people. Needless to say, that's an estimate. But if you think about that, that's a huge chunk of a population to be all in other countries. And the impact worldwide is pretty big, because there are countries that would probably shut down if they didn't have Filipino workers. I'm thinking specifically of places like Saudi Arabia and some Middle Eastern countries. And the impact worldwide is huge, and then the impact back on the Philippines is also huge, because you've got these millions of people sending money back, which eventually ends up in the hands of their family members and goes out into the local economies. So that's kind of the big picture, just to let you know how big of a deal this is in the Philippines. Now, to narrow it down a little bit, how does this affect the families of the Philippines and individuals? Well, the good part, obviously, about OFWs is people have a chance to work. People can get jobs, or they can get better jobs than they could in the Philippines. And so there's a lot of families that would have a difficult time surviving if they didn't have one or more members working overseas. And that's the positive aspect of it. But of course, there are also there are negative aspects of it too, in that one thing you end up with, usually you end up with one or more with the children. Let me phrase this properly. You end up with children that have one or even both parents missing from home. A typical OFW will be working overseas for, let's say, about 3 years, something like that, and then every 3 years, 2 or 3 years, maybe 4, then they'll come home for a few months. And that's really the only time they get with their families, is those few months that they come back home. And so as you can imagine, you end up with children who grow up and mom or dad are just not there very often, and they end up being raised by another family member. And you know that works sometimes, but in other times, as you can imagine, it has a negative influence. When I was working with students, sometimes I would work with. One of the schools where I worked was a private college in Manila. So a lot of times those students would be the children of OFWs. And sometimes it made that the student was sad because mom or dad or both were never really around that much. I mean, they were grateful, but you could understand it was also kind of sad for them. And another thing that happens too is that this sometimes causes marriages to break up, because a guy goes and works overseas. He's away from his wife so much that in some cases he has an affair. There are even cases where he'll go off and start another family. He'll have 2 families, the overseas family and then his family back in the Philippines. So that happens. And another negative aspect of the OFW deal is that there are cases where the Filipino workers are not treated very well. And the government does its best, I guess, to make sure that Filipino workers are treated well, but there are cases where they're abused, they're not paid what they're supposed to be paid. So those are just some of the different things that happen kind of at the individual and family level. And what I'm kind of getting to with all this is if you interact with Filipino culture or the Philippines and at any level, you're going to encounter this. You're going to encounter the OFW phenomenon. And just to give you an idea, I mean, even in my wife's family, I would say that I'm trying to think of the number. I mean, most of the men in my wife's family are working overseas. When I think about my wife's father, her uncles, most of them are overseas working. My wife's paternal grandfather is kind of the one who supported her studies. In the way he did that, he worked for years, for decades in Saudi Arabia. And I can think of one time when we were hanging out with, this is when my wife and I were living in Angeles City, and we were hanging out with a family that we were friends with. And while we were hanging out, I noticed I was the only man there because all of the other men were working overseas. So it just this is something that I've seen pretty much at the grassroots level, so to speak. One other thing that I can think of is I remember when we were planting the church in Angeles City, one problem we ran into is some of our best leaders would, we were working with young professionals, and more than one of our really good leaders ended up moving overseas because they found, again, it's a young professional, so he or she found the opportunity to make more money and advance himself or herself, and so that kind of would drain the leadership of our church, so to speak. And of course, we did not, if somebody told us they were moving overseas for an opportunity, we said, bless you. We didn't blame them for that at all. But I'm just giving you some examples of how it affects people just really in their day-to-day lives, in their family lives, and that type of thing. So anyway, that's something you're going to encounter if you live in the Philippines. You'll hear people talk about OFWs. You will see commercials geared towards OFWs. It's a part of the culture. It has been for a long time, and it probably will be for a long time. So I hope this video kind of gives you an overview of OFWs, and I'll try to do another one soon.